So today we'll talk through eating well after a diagnosis of cancer. Now, it's a huge topic, it really is, and there are quite a few different kind of stages really for people when it comes to diet and cancer itself. So this talk is mainly focused for people who are able to maintain their appetite and their nutritional intake, and their weight is stable at the time if they're undergoing treatment. Or it's for anybody after treatment. Okay, so anyone who's able to maintain their weight and appetite and isn't having issues potentially with swallowing difficulties or loss of appetite after treatment. Okay, and if there is anyone who doesn't fit within that cohort, I'm more than happy, as I said, to speak to you at the end and have more kind of specific tips that would be appropriate for you, because it's a little bit different, obviously, if you're finding it difficult to maintain your weight at the time. Okay, so today we'll look at sources of information, and that's really key. It's just thinking about, as somebody mentioned, there's so many different messages online and in the media. We'll hopefully work through some kind of tips of how to maybe guide your way through the information online or from friends and family. So we'll look at tips for undergoing treatment. Just for if there is anyone currently undergoing treatment, I just wanted to highlight a few things. But the main focus of the diet is going to be about a healthy, balanced diet. What is a healthy, balanced diet? We'll touch on the use of supplements, and we'll also look at physical activity as part of that kind of healthy lifestyle. Okay. So as we just mentioned, there are so many different messages when a person is diagnosed with cancer. Many people will say that they'll get information from well-meaning friends and family, from newspaper articles, from magazines, from online forums. It may be from booklets given out by healthcare professionals, but sometimes those messages can be quite conflicting and a little bit confusing. So many of us would kind of recognise the headline, "Blueberry drinks that shrink tumours," to probably be non-scientific, but sometimes the messages can be more subtle than that. A low carbohydrate diet, will reduce your risk of cancer recurrence. It sounds much more feasible. Or a diet extremely high in raw fruit and vegetables is a feasible thing to help reduce your cancer risk. But some of these, they don't have a very strong evidence base, some of these things. So it can be really confusing to understand, what are the right messages to follow. So I just firstly wanted to touch on the hierarchy of scientific evidence. Okay, this helps you it can help guide your way when you are looking for nutritional information, or if you are reading things in magazines or newspaper articles. So starting off with, I guess, the lowest or the poorest form of scientific research for what we would use in, just say, a hospital to guide as the basis of our guidelines. That would be animal or cell models. So basically, this may be things that are tested, for example, it may be chemotherapies or diets that are tested in mice. And then we'll see, on repeated occasions in various tests that they have good results. But when we try these tests then in animal or in humans, we won't really see this replicated. So extrapolating information from animal models, we really quite often will not see replicated in humans, because we have totally different physiological, systems and bodies generally. In terms of, for cellular models, that's kind of test tube based studies. So you would be looking at a single cell or a group of cells that are bathed in a substance. For example, that's probably where the last slide, the blueberry study, came from. The diet. The blueberry drink that shrinks tumours probably came from something like this, where they take a single extract from a blueberry, they'll bathe cancer cells in that particular extract and see how they respond. But again, when you extrapolate a single cell up to the human form, you won't see that replicated, because we can't bathe ourselves in that level of blueberry extract to the same extent. It's just, we have such complex systems that it just won't be replicated in the same way. Okay, so when you see animal or cellular models, that's something just to note, that we wouldn't expect that to be replicated in humans. okay, that there's a lot more testing that has to be done before we get to that stage. Observational studies are the next kind of level of research, and that's really, really large scale studies. So, for example, this is where a lot of nutritional research actually comes from. So we'll look at diet and lifestyle factors in hundreds upon thousands of people, okay? And they'll look at various lifestyle factors, so diet, exercise, smoking, etc., over these really long periods, maybe 30 or 40 years, and they'll see what chronic conditions such as diabetes, cancer, or specific forms of cancer are developed over that time frame. Then they'll kind of segregate different things. So just say fiber, for example. They'll look at the lowest fiber intake, middle, the next up, and the highest fiber intake. They break it up into quartiles, and then they'll look at the risk of colorectal cancer, for example. And they'll say having a high fiber intake reduces your risk of developing colorectal cancer. Okay, so it doesn't mean by having a high fiber intake you won't develop colorectal cancer, but it reduces your risk. Okay, so all of this looks at kind of associations or risk. It's not a direct cause. Okay, I hope you're all sticking with me. The next level up, which is randomized control trials. So this is really what we call gold standard evidence. Okay, so this is how chemotherapy is decided upon and dosed. So what you would have is you would have a control arm. For example, this is what a lot of clinical trials for oncology would be based in, where you have the best current chemotherapy, and then you would have a trial drug, which is also a good chemotherapy that they're hoping will be better than the current best. And they would look at the outcomes between two groups on the two best drugs that they have at the time, and see what is the better option. Okay, so that's really, you have an intervention and you have a control group, so you can see really the difference between the two. And then systematic reviews and meta-analysis are kind of pooled studies of randomized control trials. So they'll have, just say if there's 5 or 10 studies done in this area, they will all be kind of pooled in together. So the data is kind of, the thought is strength in numbers. Okay, so the more times you see this happen, obviously it reduces the risk of chance. Or does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have left some information on the back also, which explains this in a bit more detail. There's a little leaflet at the back called Making Sense of the Health News. And it's just something that if you are reading information online or, in the newspaper, it just kind of helps you guide your way through. So looking at what the quality of the research is. Okay, so they're just at the back anyways. So that is important, and we'll kind of touch on this a bit again throughout the talk, the types of studies. So just for anyone who is currently undergoing treatment at the moment, there's a few things that I would just really recommend while you're on treatment before we get into the body of the talk. So first, I would really recommend monitoring your weight at each chemotherapy session to see if there's any changes over time. We really recommend that you aim to keep your weight stable when you're on chemotherapy. And the main reason for that is to try and protect muscle mass. Okay, so to keep your muscles good and strong. We know that by keeping your muscles good and strong, that helps reduce fatigue and tiredness associated with treatment. It helps maintain your strength as well when you're going through treatment. So even if somebody is overweight at the time of treatment, we would still recommend keeping your weight steady. If you're experiencing any symptoms associated with your treatment at the time, do speak with your medical team and your nursing team. They're really experts in managing these symptoms and these issues. Try and have protein portions in your diet, such as lentils, beans, eggs, fish, or meat, in at least 2 to 3 portions a day. And again, that's just to help keep your muscles good and strong. Okay, so having protein regularly spaced throughout the day can help give your muscles those kind of building blocks throughout the day to keep up the muscle protein synthesis. Okay, and the last point is try and keep physically active. So if you can, and if you haven't been advised not to be, I would say try gentle walks. We're almost back into the gardening time, housework, that all helps. But if you do, exercise outside of that, so cycling, swimming, etc., these are all things that we would encourage. to help keep your muscles good and strong, and there is quite good evidence to help support to prove that keeping physically active during treatment can help reduce the risk of fatigue associated with treatment. Okay. So if you have lost weight during treatment, this is something that you should definitely raise with your medical team and nursing staff on your chemotherapy ward, and ask if there is a dietitian available, to ask to be referred to the dietitian. What we would encourage, if you find that if you're losing weight on treatment, or if your appetite is reduced on treatment, try and aim for foods rich in calories, in protein and healthy fats. Okay, so we'll go through that a bit on the next slide. Try and have small, frequent meals and snacks, so something at breakfast, lunch and dinner, and then maybe some snacks in between, 2 to 3 snacks per day. And that's just to help if your portions are smaller, to try and increase the kind of times you're eating throughout the day. Try and have nourishing drinks. Some people find drinks a little bit easier to manage in terms at snack time, so things like milk, smoothies, or even, lattes, cappuccinos. Complans are things that are available if your appetite is that bit smaller, and if your weight is reducing. And you may require nutritional supplements. So there are lots available. These drinks are kind of high in calories, proteins, and vitamins and minerals. And if you have tried them before, there's loads of them out there. So if you didn't like a particular brand or type, there are a lot of options. So I just wanted to touch on that. Just lastly, before we move on, this is just a little sheet, a shopping list for if your appetite is low, or if you require a kind of higher calorie and high protein diet. These are certain foods that can help obviously increase your total calorie and protein intake. So things like having red meat in moderation, because it's high in fat and high in calories and high in protein. Other high calorie foods would be things like oily fish, hummus, tahini, nuts, seeds, nut butters, using full fat milk or even cream, cheese, creme fraiche, etc., full fat cheese, avocados. So these are just simple ways to kind of boost the calories in the diet if you're losing weight. Okay. So other people conversely will find that they gain weight on treatment, and that is more common in certain cancers such as breast cancer or prostate cancer. Some people will find that. This can be due to decreased physical activity, hormonal changes, some part of your treatments as well. So steroids, for example, can really increase appetite and increase cravings of more kind of fatty or starchy based foods. Some people find they change their diet, when they are if they're feeling more fatigued, or if you've always been somebody on a diet, maybe you might not be cooking as much. So you're making different food choices, and fluid retention or lymphedema can also obviously affect weight. So the World Cancer Research Fund has kind of produced 10 recommendations for cancer prevention, and the final one that we can see down in the bottom left hand corner is really a diet after cancer treatment is really what we would be recommending for people in terms of cancer prevention as well. So we're going to base a lot of the talk around these points today, and hopefully they will cover a lot of the things that you have mentioned. So the number one is trying to maintain a healthy body weight. So to try and be as lean as possible, within, have a lean body mass and within a healthy body mass index. So a simple way to calculate your body mass index is to take your weight in kilograms and divide it by your height in meters twice. Okay. Otherwise, you can just Google body mass index, and there's tons of calculators online that can help you do that. But aiming to maintain a healthy body weight is really important. Okay, and the main reason for that is there are 13 forms of cancers that are associated with being overweight or obese. So trying to maintain that healthy body weight while maintaining your muscle mass is really, really beneficial. Okay, try and move more. We'll look at a slide on physical activity. But activity has a huge, huge role in terms of cancer prevention, but also has a massive role in terms of survivorship and after treatment. So in terms of risk reduction for colorectal cancer, for example, doing 45 minutes a day physical activity can reduce your risk of recurrence by 50%. And for breast cancers, doing 30 minutes a day can reduce your risk reduction by 40%. So there are really, really significant benefits to things like walking and activity. Okay. So aiming to have 75% of your diet from kind of whole grains, fruit and veg, nuts and seeds. So aiming 75% of your diet to be from plant-based sources. Try to limit sugar and fat within the diet, because having a diet high in sugar and fat leads to weight gain. Okay. Try and limit red meat to less than 2 portions. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail. And avoid processed meats. Trying to cut down on alcohol as well, and we'll cover that in more detail. Eating less salt. So salt, number one, I guess it is associated with having higher salt intakes affects blood pressure separately from cancer. But it is also associated with gastric cancer, having a higher salt intake. And there is no use for supplements for cancer prevention, but again, we'll touch on that in a bit more detail. There's specific ones. Breastfeeding your baby, I guess, is the World Cancer Research Fund, so it's looking at the world as a whole, but that's really just breastfeeding can help reduce circulating estrogen levels. So if you have a hormone-dependent breast cancer, that's really where that kind of fits in. So we'll look at it in a bit more detail. Has anyone seen the food pyramid previously? Yeah. So this was updated last year, and we'll talk through most of these things. So I guess one thing that was mentioned was foods to limit or avoid. And I guess that little red square at the top is really the foods that we're really trying to limit. So things like fizzy drinks, all of your high fat, high sugar foods. So cakes, biscuits, fizzy drinks, crisps, those types of kind of convenience foods are really things that we want to limit and avoid having on a daily basis. Try and have, if you are having them, try and limit them to once or twice a week. Okay. So oils, fats and spreads, I guess that's trying to, having them in the diet is absolutely normal to, and it's healthy to have fats within the diet. But a fat is quite rich in terms of calories. So it's double the amount of calories as protein or carbohydrates. So really you want to limit them when you can. So with things like butter or spreads, trying to use them and spread them very thinly. If you're using oil in cooking, try and measure it out and limit it to kind of, a tablespoon if you were making a dish for a family of 4. So with salad dressings as well, using a measure, so using a tablespoon rather than free pouring, because we tend to over pour when we're free pouring. So in terms of meats, fish, eggs, beans and nuts, aiming for 2 portions a day is beneficial. Obviously we talked about, they're the building blocks for our muscles. Trying to have dairy in the diet up to 3 portions a day is good, aiming for low fat dairy. And we'll look at this in a bit more detail. Having whole grains in the diet, so things like whole grain bread, cereals, pasta, brown rice, etc., aiming for about 3 to 5 portions a day. And really the bottom, so what we're really trying to have as the maximum amount in our diet is the fruit and veg. So that's where we want most of our food to be coming from those 2 bottom levels, okay? And that's because they're really rich in terms of fiber, really rich in terms of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, which obviously is good for our overall health and immunity, okay? So what do we eat, I guess, as part of the diet? We're going to get into it a bit more now. I've kind of based this talk on, the rest of the talk on questions that people have asked me over the years. So we'll work through it in that way and see, hopefully I answer all the questions, and if not, we'll touch on it again. So the first I guess section that we'll look at is carbohydrates. So one of the questions was, does sugar feed cancer? And that's a common question. It seems to be something that nearly everyone has read when they are diagnosed with cancer. So The theory of sugar feeding cancer comes from the fact that cancer cells do use sugar as a form of energy. Okay, but the truth is that all of our cells actually use sugar as a form of energy. Even when we reduce or have very, very low intakes of carbohydrates, our liver actually produces sugar. It's called gluconeogenesis, so it's the development of new glucose in the liver. Because sugar is needed for our eyes and brain, even when our body is kind of not using it as much. So it doesn't, when we look at, when cancer cells are given sugar, it doesn't cause them to grow faster, okay? But however, having a high sugar diet can lead to weight gain, which is associated with development of cancer. So keeping sugar lower in your diet and having a moderate amount is definitely a beneficial thing overall. But avoiding things like whole grains is not something I'd recommend as a whole, but being kind of portion controlled with them, okay, is a good way. A very simple way that I would recommend looking at kind of portions, it's a very crude way of measuring them, but it's looking at a rule using your hands, okay? So when it comes to carbohydrates, I would aim for a fist-sized portion of carbohydrates. It's a very basic way to do it, but if you think about potatoes, pasta, bread, rice, etc., it's a very easy way then, if you're kind of out and about, or if you're cooking something at home, that you can measure a portion. Okay, so whole grains, as I mentioned, what we're really trying to limit is refined sugar within the diet. So that's sugar that breaks down when we eat it, that we see it in our bloods, in our blood quite quickly. Okay, and that actually relates then to your glycemic index. So that's the glycemic index is how quickly a carbohydrate is broken down from when we eat it to when we see it in the blood. So the slower that process, really, the better. So by having a diet rich in whole grains, so having things like porridge or bran-based cereals, having whole grain bread, brown pasta, brown rice, etc., sweet potatoes or potatoes with the skin on, to add extra fibres is a beneficial thing. Okay. So the next slide I will touch a bit more on glycemic index and this idea of blood sugar control. So what we're aiming for with our blood sugar levels is to have kind of stable waves throughout the day of your blood sugar levels, okay? What we want to avoid is kind of peaks and troughs. So when you eat something that might be a more refined carbohydrate, we just say if you have a fizzy drink, for example, if you have Coke or 7-Up or Sprite or something like that, and when you drink it, there's very little work that your body has to do to absorb it. It passes through the stomach very quickly and is absorbed in your gut. So you'll see much more of a red spike here, because it enters into the bloodstream very quickly. You get a sugar high. Your body then has to deal with it very quickly, so you get a crash after that. And for some people, there is a theory that can increase people's appetites again when you get that reduction in your blood sugar levels. So then you go and eat again. So that's, I think somebody had mentioned food for energy, and that's one thing that is a very important thing, this idea of kind of peaks and troughs and ways to kind of control that. If you're having foods that are lower glycemic index, so they're rich in terms of fiber, etc., let's take brown rice or whole grain bread. They're much less processed, so your body has to do quite a bit of work actually when you eat something like brown rice or whole grain bread. It has to really break down through the husk of the rice, etc., and that might take an hour to significantly longer than something that's quite refined. You'll then see quite a steady increase in your blood sugar levels over time, and also fiber holds food in your stomach for longer, so you're much less likely to feel hungry in between your meals. So what we would avoid is trying to eat regularly throughout the day, avoid skipping meals, so having kind of something at breakfast, lunch and dinner, and including complex carbohydrates within those meals is a good thing. Try and limit foods rich in refined sugar, and choosing low GI carbohydrates. balancing your meals as well can be a really, really good way to reduce your blood sugar levels. So if you're combining your meal with protein and healthy fats, that's actually a really useful way, because they also hold food in the stomach for longer. So a good way to describe it would be taking a baked potato. If you eat a baked potato and you just eat the flesh, that's actually quite high glycemic index, because there's very little work that your body needs to do. You're not giving it any fiber. So you'll probably have more of a red line. If you add the skin onto that, that's going to slow down, because that fiber is going to hold your food in the stomach for longer, so that's going to lower that line a little bit. And then if you added something like tuna and maybe some low-fat mayonnaise and a side salad, that gives you more fiber, protein and fat, which again is going to give you a really nice curve and hopefully reduce that kind of peaks and troughs that you could experience if you just ate the fleshy bit. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the next thing that I wanted to touch on was dairy and milk alternatives. So there has been, I think, again, this is a really contentious issue and something that seems to come up time and time again. There is no association or link between dairy and cancer. So there was, a lot of this stems from research that was done called the China study, which was done in the 80s. This was an observational study which only looked at 200 people. Okay, so when we think about the European prospective investigation into cancer, the EPIC study that was done, within the last 2 decades, that had 500,000 people in the information that guided fiber and colorectal cancer risk. Okay, so 200 people in an observational study is really, really poor methodology. It's very low, and a lot of it could just be chance. But what they looked at, unfortunately, the message has stuck around for a really, really long time. They found that the area that was more vegan they found that the vegan area it was based in China, had a lower risk of developing cancer, whereas the meat containing and dairy containing part of China had a higher risk of cancer. But it didn't rule out things like people's body mass index or weight. It didn't look at industrialization within the areas. There's many flaws. The World Cancer Research Fund has done a huge amount of work of it. They do continuous reports that are updated every 5 to 10 years in every separate cancer group. And they haven't found any associations with dairy and cancer risk. Okay, if anything, dairy has been found to be quite protective for colorectal cancer, because higher calcium intakes are known to be protective. So it's really something that is beneficial to have in the diet. For people who have undergone treatment, having dairy in the diet or having calcium in your diet is incredibly important for your bone health after treatment. Because things like steroids can impact on bone health in the longer term. So it's just something to be mindful of. So hormones in milk is something that, again, sometimes comes up when, in clinic. And this, again, is information that came out in the 80s. And it looked at, it's mainly actually based in America, because there was some use of different kind of sex hormones, bovine stimulating hormones, to increase milk production. This is not something that affects us in any way in the European Union. It's totally banned, and it isn't banned actually on health grounds. It's banned on kind of animal welfare grounds. But anywhere within the European Union, we're totally banned from importing any milk, and the use isn't allowed. Within meat or milk, it's not an issue for us. But again, if you're reading things online, this is something that can come up, because there is practice for its use in America. So full fat versus low fat, I would recommend lower fat generally. So low fat milk or low fat natural yogurts are good in terms of good forms of calcium, but lower in terms of total calories. I'd be mindful of using low-fat fruit-based yogurts, because sometimes there are added sugars. So using low-fat natural yogurts and maybe adding some fruit might be a little bit of a better way to get around that. And then dairy alternatives, it's a huge market. It's really exploded over the last 15 years. There's so many different brands available in terms of rice milks, oat milk, soy milk, etc. Dairy alternatives, so rice milk or oat milk, are naturally very low in protein, so it wouldn't be a place that I would, it's not something I would recommend for having, protein in your diet, whereas soy milk or dairy are actually, quite good sources of protein. If you are using any milk alternative, the main thing that I would recommend is just making sure you get one that is fortified with calcium and vitamin D. So any of the shop bought ones are, but if some people will make it at home, like almond milk, for example. If you make it at home, it's just really 10 almonds that you soak in a litre of water. So there's not really that much in it when you blend it down. So getting one that is fortified is really important. But it's totally fine to have in the diet if that's something that you prefer. It's a choice for some people, and some people just prefer the taste. So soy products, this is an area that has changed in the last 10 years. There was originally concern around having soy products in your diet if you had hormone-dependent cancers such as breast cancers. This is because soy contains what we call phytoestrogens, phyto just meaning plant, so plant-based estrogens. And there was a concern that these would increase, obviously if you're eating estrogens, that this would increase your circulating estrogen levels. With a lot more focus and research in the area, we found actually quite the opposite, that these kind of phytoestrogens or soy-based estrogens mimic human estrogen within the body, so they bind to estrogen receptors and reduce the production of estrogen within the body. Very similar to what tamoxifen does, but in a less potent way. I would never stop tamoxifen if you're on it, but it is a beneficial thing to actually have in the diet. So the American Institute of Cancer Research recommends avoiding soy supplements because we should be able to get things through the diet. But having up to 3 portions a day is totally safe. So things like edamame beans, tofu, tempeh, soy milk, miso, soy yogurts. And actually soy is very cardioprotective because it's very high in soluble fibers. So that means it helps reduce that bad cholesterol within the body because soluble fibers bind with bile salts in the gut, and you excrete them basically. So this helps you reduce your cholesterol in your blood. So fish, again, the World Cancer Research Fund about 10 years ago did a really good grading of fish using those observational studies, or looked at animal meats, I should say, fish and animal meats. They found that fish is a protective thing in terms of cancer development, and so it's a beneficial thing to have fish in the diet. They found that poultry and white meats are neutral, that they don't have a negative effect or a beneficial effect in terms of cancer development. And then with red meats, having more than 500 grams per week has a negative effect in terms of colorectal cancer, and processed meats should really be avoided. Okay, so there are really significant benefits from having fish in the diet. Aiming for 2 portions of oily fish per week for heart health, but also the anti-inflammatory effect of fish, of oily fish. So that's things like salmon, mackerel, pilchards, herring, fresh tuna, but not tin tuna. It's leached out when they tin tuna. But any of those are really, really good sources of protein, but also for omega fatty acids. It's a beneficial thing. So the anti-inflammatory effect of omega-3 fats within cancer treatment, it's still something that they're I guess assessing but the current kind of train of thought with the mechanism is that every single cell within the body has a fatty membrane around it. So every single cell has that. And all of these cells signal to each other through this fatty acid membrane. And when you eat oily fish, when you eat omega-3 fats, some of those omega-3s actually go into these fatty membranes. And they have much less potent effects the way they signal to each other is much less, but it is much more beneficial. So it reduces systemic inflammation within the body. So for that, it is a good thing to have in the diet. So meat, we've touched a bit on this. Obviously, we talked about that grading of poultry and red meat. Really, with red meat, we're trying to aim for less than 500 grams per week. So I would say 2 portions per week, but it's 500 grams. So that's kind of a family pack if you think of mincemeat. So it is quite a bit, really, if you think throughout the week. And poultry, as we said, is neutral. It's a very lean source of protein, so it's absolutely, good to have in the diet. It is good, to have other forms of protein within the diet, things like lentils, pulses, chickpeas, beans, and I guess on a sustainable level, I guess this is quite a hot topic with the Lancet report that came out last month. But even aiming for 1 to 2 meat-free days per week, and aiming for more vegetarian sources of protein, 1 to 2 days a week is a good way to try and build up variety in the diet. And vegetarian sources of protein are also, usually quite high in soluble fibre, and fibre in general, insoluble and soluble fibre. So a beneficial thing to add in. So just making sure I'm sticking to time. So fruit and veg. So is 5 a day really enough? I'll draw something actually. It's probably the easiest way to describe this. So does anyone know where the 5 a day came from? This came from an observational study. So when we look at where 5 a day came from, this comes from observational studies. Again, those long, research studies which might have, hundreds of, 200,000 or 300,000 or 500,000 people in it. And what they looked at was health benefits of your fruit and veg intake. They found that, anything below 5 portions a day, which equates to about 400 grams, because a portion is about 80 grams. They found that there was no difference in health benefits over time if you have less than 5 a day. But after 5 a day, they found that there's a linear increase. So every portion that you have after that point increases the health benefits. So really, the idea is the more the better with it. Okay, so it's really anything less than that doesn't have a health benefit that was seen within these specific research studies, but the more the better with it. Okay. So in terms of sugar that's contained in fruit, well, I guess if we're thinking about just say 7 portions of fruit and veg a day, aiming for 2 portions to come from fruit and 5 from vegetables. And that's really just, I would never be concerned about sugar that comes in fruit. Okay, I think if we're limiting things like cakes, biscuits, more kind of convenience foods, that's really where we will get most of our kind of quick acting sugar. If you're eating fruit with the fibre, so with the skin on the fruit, that is going to hold in your tummy for a little bit longer and take a while to break down. That leads me on to juicing. In terms of with juicing, really all you're doing with that, obviously you get quite a bit of, you can pack more into a glass than what you can, I guess, if you were placing fruit in a glass. You can probably get 3 or 4 pieces of fruit into a glass, but that just actually means that you're having, if you're blending all the fibre down out of that, you're going to have more calories, and yes, more nutrients in terms of your vitamins and minerals, but you're also going to get a lot of sugar. Okay, so it's not that dissimilar, having a smoothie in terms of the sugar, the teaspoons isn't that dissimilar from having a glass of Coke or, something, a fizzy drink. So although there are benefits within it, there's obviously a lot more vitamins and minerals and lots of good antioxidants. With juices, I would limit them to about 150 ml, so a breakfast glass a day is really all we need. Okay. And then in terms of antioxidants and phytochemicals, what I would say is eat the rainbow. Try and eat all different colours, all of the different colour fruit and veg give you different health benefits. So all of them have individual properties associated with the colour. So when you are having, if you're having your dinner in the evening, or if you looked at your vegetables and fruit throughout the week, try and have all of the different colours of the rainbow within that. Okay. In terms of alcohol, the guidelines actually on alcohol has kind of changed over the last few years. Really, there isn't any kind of safe level of alcohol, and the guidance really on it is to try and limit where possible, to try and reduce the amount, because alcohol affects cancer risk in different ways. So some of the byproducts when we're breaking down alcohol within the body, that can damage DNA. So there's two different ways that it can damage DNA, and it can also help reduce your absorption of a lot of your vitamins and minerals. So in two ways that can they're two of the kind of main mechanisms that are thought that how alcohol kind of affects cancer risk. So for men, the advice is 17 standard units per week, and women it's 11 standard units. So one standard unit being half a pint, or 125 mils of wine. So that's kind of the current. That has reduced quite significantly actually from 21 standard units for men and 16 for women. So and that is associated mainly with these with more evidence around the impact in terms of cancer risk. In terms of use of supplements, what we'd really aim for is a food-first approach. If you have a diet that's rich in vitamins, in fruit and vegetables, and eating all different colours within your diet, there isn't necessarily a need for having, a vitamin or mineral supplement unless it's been recommended for a specific reason by your doctor. Okay. There are certain things that I would consider in the diet. So anyone over the age of 50, there is a kind of national guidance on vitamin D supplementation of 10 micrograms per day. And that's really because where we live, Ireland obviously we only get enough sunshine actually to make vitamin D in our skin from May to September. So it's quite a short window, and if we have bad summer, it's probably even shorter. So that is something that is recommended. It is incredibly important for bone health, and actually it does play a role in immunity and immune function as well. So it is a beneficial thing in that way. Selenium also plays a role in Immunity. It isn't something I would recommend taking a supplement, but having 2 Brazil nuts a day will give you 75% of your selenium needs. So it's a very simple way of getting your needs without necessarily taking a supplement. Omega-3 fats, trying to have oily fish in your diet as well, is a really beneficial thing for heart health and for kind of inflammation in general. I would recommend, it isn't recommended when people are on cancer treatment to take any vitamin or mineral supplements, because it's not always understood how the vitamin and mineral supplements react with cancer treatments. So if you are taking any supplements, I would speak to your doctor or one of the nurses on the day ward if you are having treatment at the time. Okay. And then lastly, physical activity. So the national guidance is aiming for 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week. Okay, so that's about 30 minutes, 5 days a week. And when we say moderate, I guess what that would be is if you were talking to someone, if you were out for a walk, that you're slightly puffed when you're talking to them, that you're kind of, you're not having a full-blown conversation, you're struggling a bit, or just slightly, your breath is kind of noticeable. That's really what we'd mean by moderate intensity exercise. There is quite a bit of research now showing this combination of aerobic exercise, which would be your cycling, swimming, walking, running, works really well if you combine it with resistance exercise. So that's things like using the stairs, or using light weights, or even kind of squats, etc. That kind of resistance exercise is very good for improving muscle tone and maintaining muscles. So that's physical activity. So in summary, aiming for a healthy weight, and if you're on chemotherapy, weight stability while you're on treatment, and then maybe reassessing at the end of treatment whether you need to lose weight, or if that's something that's required at the time. Try and be physically active if you can during treatment. It's not easy, every day when you're on treatment, especially if fatigue is an issue. But trying to be active on the good days is definitely the a good thing. After treatment, it's definitely something to try and build up, and fatigue is an issue for people after treatment as well. So again, using the good days when you can, or breaking it up, so doing short walks, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but doing that a few times throughout the day to build up your tolerance is beneficial. Try and limit refined sugar, so refined carbohydrates, and aim for whole grain carbohydrates or more complex carbohydrates in your diet. Try and reduce your total fat in your diet by choosing low-fat dairy products. Again, if you're limiting your red meat to 2 portions a week, that will also assist with that. And using cooking methods, that where you don't have to use as much fat or oil, so things like grilling, poaching, saute is an easier way to reduce your total fat. Try and eat the rainbow, so aim to have a lot of different colour fruit and vegetables within your diet, and limiting your alcohol intake. If you're losing weight, ask your doctor to speak to a dietitian, even if you're after treatment, or speak to your GP about it. Okay. So these are just some sources of information. There's some really good booklets, and I couldn't print them out because they're about 50 pages, but the first 2 are really good for really good resources. So the first one is eating well during treatment, and there's another one, eating well after treatment. And it goes through about all things about diet and lifestyle, and also kind of symptom management as well. And then I find the American Institute of Cancer Research